We have an extremely experienced panel up here who have collectively worked on an untold number of company community dialogue processes, literally in every corner of the world. Antonio Bernales to my left, he is an extremely experienced mediator, facilitator from Peru, who is also a movie star. He was a mediator in the Tintaya Mines process that's in one of those 3 award-winning videos. But that's only one of the many natural resource company community conflicts that he's worked on. And he has been a leader in this space in all of South America for a very long time. David Fairman to my left, as I mentioned, I worked with David Fairman at the Consensus Building Institute, where he's managing director with a focus on international programs. David has worked in all parts of the world on all types of public policy, international development, natural resource conflicts that bring together all kinds of stakeholders, from companies and communities to governments and civil society organizations to multinational, multilateral actors in the international space. Further to the left is Prof. Femi Ajibola, another of our movie stars, who played a pivotal role in helping to facilitate the relationship, in particular between Chevron and communities in the Niger Delta. Not one role, but a role since 2004 that has spanned the generation of those agreements. But it's not the sum total of his experience. He's been involved in many other types of those relationships in the Niger Delta, which is, I think we can all agree, one of the most difficult places to imagine doing this kind of work, where conspiracy theory abounds. And I had the privilege of working directly with Prof on that process, and I'm looking forward to his perspectives. And then farther to the left is Gina Barbieri from the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman Office of the World Bank Group, where she, an independent accountability mechanism of the World Bank Group that that provides a grievance mechanism, an accountability mechanism against the performance standards of the International Finance Corporation and MIGA. And Gina, from her position, sees a tremendous number of these conflicts and plays a slightly different kind of role from that position, a role that helps to convene and a role that looks at capacity and a role that helps to try to design and set up effective dialogue processes. But Gina is also a very experienced mediator herself from South Africa, who prior to joining CAO actually was in the field doing this work as well. So we're looking forward to her perspectives from all of those various places she sat. With that introduction, I mentioned we want to frame up this panel as all of the roles that neutrals play before, during, and after the small moment in time that we tend to focus on of seeking resolution. And I want to start by asking our panelists about all of the work that happens, all the challenges and the work that has to happen before getting parties to the table.
So let me talk a little bit about the perspective of convening dispute resolution processes from the lens of the CAO, and then more with my hat of mediator on. We touched on this yesterday, and the convening power of the CAO cannot be underestimated. I think we have to recognize that when the CAO receives a complaint from communities, there's almost an immediate entry point to approach the company who has to let us in because of their agreements with the lending institution to talk to us and to, in some sense, give us the space to come in and explain what it is that we do, and where appropriate and relevant to identify where dispute resolution potentially can be of assistance, and if not, obviously inform them of the compliance process. And so that convening power is incredibly useful and helpful. And when you don't have that convening power, it's often tricky to know how to access the private sector if you're coming in off the back of a complaint from a community. And get the space to start having a conversation and a dialogue with the company around what are the benefits of dispute resolution. Because it doesn't seem to me that the private sector at large rushes out to find third-party neutrals to help them resolve disputes. And I think often it's because perhaps they don't have a taste for it, they haven't seen and understood how that can work. They might lack the capacity to actually do that, depending on their scale. And And having said that, when the CAO receives a complaint and goes in, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, if we get the go-ahead for a dispute resolution process, how do we make sure that parties are committed to participating in good faith, and they're not using the dispute resolution process as a smokescreen to ward off a compliance appraisal, for example, or to ward off court action? And so some of the aspects that we need to look out for as a CAO very, very carefully is during the assessment of the complaint to start identifying what are the interests underpinning this complaint. So often we get complaints that are supported by civil society organizations that are able to really bolster complaints with a lot of facts. And there can be a proliferation of issues that are brought to the table. And what we do in the assessment phase is to try and better understand, having put it down on paper, let's have a conversation about what it is that you feel you need, what are your interests in this dispute, and what do you think the best ways of addressing the dispute are. So the assessment phase of a dispute and a potential dispute is incredibly important. And in that phase, some of the things that we look to do is we look to identify the potential stakeholders. So once we've got a handle on the interests, and that's not only from the communities, that's also from the perspective of the company. I think we need to remember that if we're going to engage in a dispute resolution process, it needs to be to the benefit of both parties. It can't be a one-sided initiative. And I think we always need to remember that what we're trying to do is the proverbial win-win, if possible. I could go on for quite some time on the pre-assessment phase, because it really is the stage at which we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy. One of the aspects that we grapple with and that we need to work with really closely is representation. And I don't actually agree with a comment that was made yesterday about, and I heard it in a couple of the forums at the UN conference around the tendency for lawyers to feel, or for ADR practitioners to say, we don't want lawyers in the room. Lawyers shouldn't be near this. This is something lawyers don't do. In fact, I think that's inherently incorrect. I think there's a role for lawyers to play in these ADR processes. And Bernie May has done a lot of work around conflict ally work. In other words, before parties come together, what is the role that can be played in building the capacity of parties to engage with each other in a dispute resolution process? And I think lawyers who are trained in this area can play a phenomenal role in that regard. Not only that, I think lawyers play a really critical role in representing clients at the table, just as civil society does. So I don't think I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they're ways of the two streams pulling together. And I think representation is a critical aspect to figure out and assess and establish before you start a dispute resolution process. For us as a CAO, when you receive a complaint on behalf of 250,000 community members in Chad, you need to know, if you get the green light for a dispute resolution process because it's what the parties want, that the representatives sitting at the table actually legitimately and adequately represent the communities who have been impacted or potentially will be impacted, and that those representatives have mandates to be there.
You've just touched upon, I think, a really critical issue that I think many companies and communities would say is one of the biggest obstacles to these kinds of processes, figuring out who to sit down and talk with. Certainly we hear that all the time about communities. There are 850,000. Equally, we hear that from communities about companies. Who do I talk to in order to have effective resolution that we can reach agreements? David, can I turn to you and ask you about the role that assessment can play in that process of identifying the parties that need to be at the table and how it helps you to do that?
Oftentimes I think assessments stir up trouble, but they do it if they're well done, they do it in a constructive way. On the community side, I think we spend a good deal of time trying to understand who is directly and visibly representing the community or members of the community on an issue. And then we also need to look at the question of how others in the community perceive that leadership and whether there are others who either would like themselves to be in a representative role or who challenge directly the claimed leadership of others in the community. And as neutrals coming in to try and understand this and try and through assessment, articulate a path forward, or at least a set of options for a community, we sometimes get very directly sucked into prolonged and difficult disputes or differences in a political sense within that community, and we need to help them in some sense to identify and deal with those issues if there are going to be constructive ways forward. The assessment is not meant to be a mediation within the community. It's meant to try and answer the set of questions that Gina articulated. But by surfacing those questions and by identifying stakeholders who have different views on representation, we do often find ourselves in the assessment process directly going through multiple rounds of conversation with stakeholders in the community to see whether they can find an arrangement among themselves that will enable them to be effectively represented. On the company side, I think it's also really interesting that, let's put it this way, both vertically from headquarters down to operations and field level, and across the field levels, company representatives who are primarily focused on community relations, those who are primarily focused on operational issues, on getting infrastructure built, on getting the resource extracted, and those who have sometimes a government relations function. You need also to address those internal dynamics and to ensure, both, as Gina said, I think, that there are company representatives who can credibly and in good faith represent the company in that process, and also help them start to address some of their own internal puzzles. Oh, let's not forget legal. And I want to strongly support Gina's point that legal representation is important here. It is also, I would say, in many cases very important to be clear about the role that attorneys will play relative to that of other managers on the company side. So by the time we get to the end of an assessment process, if we've done our job well, we have stirred up some trouble, but we've also helped both communities and companies work their way to a point where they feel they've addressed those questions in a constructive enough way to get started.
Antonio, I'm wondering if you can, I know in your work you've seen that by the time you are asked to assist in a conflict, the parties are already very far down the path of acrimony, and there's a lot of history already between them. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about how to address that and opportunities to get involved earlier in a process, what companies can do, what communities can do. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the preventive role that can be played through this kind of assessment.
My point is that if we think differently, probably we will find out the value of thinking in the different way to think social license, in the way that perhaps we need to shift from the perspective of the business, which means the project, and to think on the perspectives of local development of the people, and try to figure out differently. For instance, if you need to get the social license from the people, then you are fighting all the time in order to see how good are you and people are looking for you, if you are already a good partner or not. And then it's demand-driven because the people want more of you, but not exactly accepting or knowing what kind of business that I'm doing in my territory or in the area where I live. So thinking, if we put in the center of the idea, the discussion, what is the vision of the communities, including local governments, of how we see our development, and how this development can be open to new opportunities of different kind of investment. And then if we know how to match that kind of opportunity and risk in our vision on development, perhaps there will be a huge shift from the perspective of how to engage one with each other. And that would have many, in my opinion, positive and new venues that doesn't exist now. For instance, if you go to a community which is a green field where before they had no experience to dealing with oil and gas or whatever the activity is, they know little, if nothing, about that activity. They don't know about the risks and the possibilities that the business has. So if you go in the very early stage you empower the people and you let the people know much better what are the opportunities this new business may have for their life. And then they start learning how to adapt and to watch if this is a true opportunity for them to come along the life cycle.
One of the themes that's emerged already from the three interventions and throughout our conversations yesterday is the theme of capacity of parties to make informed decisions, capacity of parties to engage. Gina speaking about the capacity to have that dialogue, capacities for representation, et cetera. Prof, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your experience with the capacity building side, the importance of that role, and different kinds of capacity building that have featured in the work that you've done. And then I want to get other kinds of capacity building that we've seen. So maybe you could speak a little bit about the role of capacity building in your experience.
When it started in 2005, and we were called upon to facilitate the negotiation between Chevron and the communities, we really didn't do much capacity building. And the first one we did took about 7-8 months, before we could get agreement. But in 2008, we had a different model, and we did this with CBI. We had capacity building done in terms of providing training to both parties on negotiation skills, and we saw a significant impact of that in the way the negotiation went. We were a bit more focused. The participants were more focused. They focused on their interests clearly, and we were able to refer them to the things that they learned during the training, and that helped a lot. So it was extremely useful. Now, the model that we were looking at was a model that was trying to empower the community members in the development process itself. And in the first 3 years, it was very clear that a major constraint and challenge to the process was the capacity of the community leaders to actually do development, to take the kinds of decisions that they were required to take. And since 2009, thereabout, there has been a program that's building the capacity of these community members and the leaders in those things, And we've seen significant improvement, and that is a major component of the GMOU, and I think going forward is going to be that. What we need to do is to assure ourselves that the capacity building that is being given actually is leading to development on the ground.
David, I know it's something that is built into the way that CBI approaches its work. Could you speak about the capacity building with neutrals? Certainly there is not a giant pool of experienced people in this space, and broaden it to other parts of the world in ways you've done this. Yeah.
I do want to speak to that, and I also want to speak to capacity building for companies, because I think it's a really interesting ongoing story. But first, yes, there are a lot of disputes out there, and not that many folks and that many organizations who are explicitly committed to an impartial role with a skill set that can be effective in handling those disputes. That's just a reality. And although many of us bemoan the fact that there's not more demand for neutral services, so many of these disputes would be handled better through non-judicial facilitated means. The reality is that if demand were to double tomorrow, you wouldn't find the people to handle it. And so for our organization and for a number of others that are in part committed to building the field, partnering is a very, very important part of not just a practical matter of how we get the work done in different parts of the world, partnering with excellent people like Prof and others in different areas, but it's also something that's absolutely necessary for the longer run if this capacity is to be made widely available to communities and companies and governments around the world. So the best way, I think, to partner to build capacity is very much through doing work together, but it is also to offer explicitly training and ongoing support to people who are practicing this work around the world and want to be part of a peer group that can exchange information and resources and provide kind of structured feedback and reflection to each other. Also on the company side, that I would say relative to even 10 years ago, we are seeing a global shift among the leading multinationals in the extractive sector, and I won't go beyond that because my expertise doesn't extend beyond that. But in the extractive sector, we are seeing the leading multinationals, not uniformly, but significant groundswell, raising the corporate profile of not just CSR broadly, but stakeholder engagement and even more specifically community engagement, and raising the professional status and support for people doing work with their community stakeholders in different operational sites and exploration sites. This is an uneven process, and it's one that draws criticism when companies claim more than they've actually achieved, when there are disputes internal to the company between the folks doing the community relations work and the folks trying to get the resource out of the ground or out of the country. And yet, those with this commitment are actively seeking support to build their own staff capacity to do this work better. And I would say overall, I think that is an encouraging trend, and one that that communities and folks in the NGO community should welcome, although not necessarily expecting dramatic change overnight. And I do think there's a role for those of us who are predominantly neutrals, but who also have experience to offer and expertise to offer, to help them build that capacity in the same way that we work globally with some of our NGO partners to help bring effective negotiation skills to communities. So I just want to name that I think capacity development is important across the board. And last, and certainly not least, for governments struggling. I think Antonio named such an important point. As more governments try to be proactive in their planning processes, in their economic development processes, in broadening and deepening the range of stakeholders who can participate in setting those policies and in setting regional development plans, they too need help to build the capacity to manage that engagement effectively.
Great. Gina, do you want to come back in?
On the building of capacity of neutrals, in South Africa there's a saying which is local is lekker, which is an Afrikaans expression that means local is good and local is nice. And I think it's important to remember in dispute resolution to use local capacity wherever possible. And where that capacity is sit on the ground is to build the capacity, but respecting indigenous alternative dispute resolution practices within the region, because I think that's really important. And then just to pick up something briefly on representation, David, you mentioned around understanding what the role of a representative is in the process. I think one of the most difficult things in mediation is to punch through parties' positions to get to the underlying interests that a dispute resolution is there to address if possible. And the only way you can do that effectively is if you're having a conversation with the people who are actually impacted by the conflict and the dispute. And so when you see traditional Western mediations taking place and you train through the Western methodology, you see lawyers in the room, but the lawyers aren't the ones who are talking. The people who are talking are the company representatives and the impacted individual or individuals. And so I think that's important to understand, and that's why the capacity building for representatives is actually really critical, because it's only through that capacity building that they really truly understand and trust the process.
I want to ask you about what happens after agreement is reached and the sustainability of specific agreements and the ways in which neutral parties can help to ensure the sustainable implementation of agreements that are reached.
I think the starting point really is to craft agreements that have a monitoring and implementation function within them. In other words, sustainability who's going to be responsible for that and where are the resources going to come for that enforcement. When you're crafting the agreement, you have to have a long-term vision of how sustainable is the outcome, and I think you have to be prepared to commit resources to building capacity where capacity is needed.
We're not just talking about a dispute, we're talking about an ongoing relationship between parties that will be subjected to all kinds of external impacts. Business impacts are going to occur, political shocks are going to occur, and in part a lot of this is about the absorptive capacity of those relationships to create a sustainable platform for dialogue. Antonio, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that you did with the stakeholder mesas on the Tintaya process and the ways in which it reflects that idea of a continuing platform for dialogue as opposed to a resolution of a specific dispute.
To tell you briefly, in the 1990, so even before the companies like BHP took over, started the reaction in the population of Espinar provinces, which is the second ring, with 60 communities, not 6. And they took the mine, they assault the mine for the first time. And the people in Tintaya said that the 23rd of May will be the day of it's not exactly the word, the raging day of Tintaya against the mine. And that date has been repeatedly every year a kind of either a direct attack to the mine or just walking around the mine and coming out. So it's already a culture of the relationship between a large population, not only the 6 communities, related to the mine. Why? Because they believe at the very beginning, the Peruvian government and then the companies took over didn't respect the rights of the people. So now the entire case is in a different momentum, because after the latest crisis in the area, 3 of our ministers need to go to talk with the mayor. And now there's a kind of roundtable going on, but at the provincial side. Because the government, the company, BHP at that moment, and the provincial side got an agreement to give 3%, to provide a fund, a social fund for development, 3% of the net benefit of the company every year. But for the last year, days before the 23rd of May, they were already together in the table because the community, the mayor asked for 30% instead of 3% of the revenues sharing. So, as you can imagine, the conflict exploded. In many of the cases, it's very hard to engage the government. For instance, in the case of Tintaya, the communities didn't trust the government. It was the Fujimori era. And the company also said, okay, we better go along, communities and company, without the government. But it's not sustainable in the long term. If we think how is the impact of a mining activity or another activity, it's a long-term venue, it's a long-term business. It's shape and give the opportunity for a community, for a country to grow in the good or the less good way for 100 years. The question is, how can we go from case by case to a systematic approach? And that's the key question.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. And we're definitely going to come right back to this systematic question and how you make these processes more resilient. And I'd like to ask Prof to come in on both the platform being resilient and the process being resilient, the challenges over time, the opportunities to address specific issues that come up over time, but the challenges of maintaining that platform over time.
Well, in the Niger Delta, there's been a relationship for 40, 50 years between the oil companies and the communities. And these relationships have not been going on well. So, really, by the time the GMOU came on board, the idea was to create a platform that will look at all the issues. The platform will look at development issues, they will look at issues of employment, they will look at issues of local content in terms of contracting, and then they will come up with ways, systemic ways of dealing with, conflict issues as they arise. Now, what is good about such a systemic platform is that there are issues that can arise that that you had not anticipated. Oil spills, and an example was that in Bayelsa State, not too long ago, earlier this year, there was a gas blowout on a Chevron rig, and the whole rig got burnt, and there were community agitation. But because Chevron already had the GMOU platform, it decided to put together a committee that involved the NGOs, the Chevron people, some government personnel, and also the community leaders who were operating that platform, to sit down and take a look at ways in which the issues could be resolved. Now, there were already cases that were already going to court. And by the time we analyzed all the claims, it came to about a lot more than $40 billion from different groups. But by the time we sat down and started looking at what could be done, we were able to come up with some allocation for development and for compensation that was satisfactory to the community, and it was much less than 1% of what the claims were. And everybody was happy because they already had a platform on which to talk about it.
I want to come back to you and Antonio and then to David and Gina on the challenge of maintaining that platform over time.
Well, you know, there is a general feeling sometimes when things were very bad and you get a little improvement, you get a feeling that, oh, okay, I think we have arrived. We're already there. And one has to be extremely careful because you need to continue to monitor and evaluate and assure yourself that what you are doing is actually achieving the objectives. So it is a process that you need to work on, you know, continuously. You need to ensure that you put in process improvement systems. I think even on the company side, there's a tendency to, after you've gotten some results, to feel that, you know, you are doing well. And in that case, you could actually fall back and start having problems. And we've had a little bit of that, you know. But I think there's the sensitivity, you know, that we need to check. And we have actually put in place a review every 3 years to ensure that we monitor what is happening.
Antonio, in the past you've talked about the generational challenge that happens with these long-term processes as younger generations come up. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you can effectively manage that?
Well, this is a question, open question, because that is a challenging one. As we may understand, communities are not perfect. Communities are divided. We have political games inside. We have countries who are more stable and one unstable. We have process of decentralization. We're in a process now that many countries are challenging Washington consent. We are thinking now in the new role for governments and even governing owned companies. So it's an evolving, how we call it, the dynamic of the conflict at different levels that plays a role. But one thing is a constant problem in different settings is the very low participation of youth in those kind of processes. And if you see the people either in Tintaya or in other cases, 10 years playing a very good role of leaderships by trying to convince and to come along the community who has the right to vote in the community. But in 10 years, you have people who used to have 10 years. Now they have 20, and they need to work. And there is no way to fulfill that demand of work in any communities by 1 or 2 or 3 companies. Then there are big challenges that come in these cases. And so again, that gives me the floor to take the idea of we need to think in a development plan based of private and public investment. The community funds can play a very big role there because they may find out the ways how to prepare the people, the next generation, not only to have the connection with the reality and the vision of the community, but also to give them the possibility to have access to work.
David, do you want to broaden us on the challenge of the resilience of these processes and mechanisms and approaches?
If we're talking about the role of neutrals in the long run, if we're going to be effective, we are, in a sense, we need to be development professionals. That is, we need to take seriously that our role is also to address some of the questions that the communities, that the companies, that the governments need to answer about beyond the current context of the dispute. What is the set of institutions, not just the set of relationships, but the set of institutions that is going to enable effective, ongoing dialogue and decision-making about development in this location? And to do that well, I think we as neutrals don't have to have all the answers. That is not our job. But we have to be, as part of our job, looking at the question of how, whether it's in 3 months, 3 years, or 30 years, how do you all envision the future here? And as soon as we put that question out on the table, we need to recognize the differences in time horizons. Now, oftentimes we hear the criticism, oh, communities, they're so poor and desperate, they're just interested in the job or the handout tomorrow. In our experience, at least in my experience, it's actually not so. In fact, generally speaking, members of the communities tend to have the longest time horizon. They're the ones asking, where will we be in 30 years? The companies often, because their investments are relatively long-lived, are looking, at a time horizon of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Governments, particularly elected officials, it's complicated because their immediate horizons are the next election. And even civil servants, they're going to be transferred in many cases, or they're kind of related to the political process. So we need to deal with the reality that trying to talk about the long term, you need to recognize that the incentives, particularly for government to set up longer term structures and processes, that's complex. And oftentimes it comes to the community and the company to do the kind of extraordinary work that Prof and others have been doing in Nigeria, that Antonio and others have been doing in Tintaya and other places to set up resilient institutions that at least enable the company and the community to talk well together over time, and hopefully to bring in government in an appropriate way. Just the last thing I would say is we need to approach this question of resilience with a lot of humility. We cannot neither we nor any stakeholder can engineer a foolproof, a future-proof system or structure. But what we can do, I think what is realistic, is to make sure, as in the case that Prof mentioned of the periodic evaluation, that there is active ongoing reflection on how well we are doing at meeting unanticipated challenges and what we could do to prepare ourselves better. And that works on every level, from the core question of who's going to represent us down the road, where will young people be, to what are we going to do when this operation shuts down? Are we on a pathway so that 20 years from now, or 10 or 5, when this operation is no longer present, when the stream of revenue from this operation is no longer present, that we've got some kind of livelihood base, some kind of economic development strategy for the longer run? That shouldn't be only the job of the community and the company. It should also be the job of government, but at a minimum, the community and the company need to be looking at it.
Gina, I'm going to give you sort of one last hit at this, but I want to prep our audience that as soon as Gina's finished, I'm going to be opening to you to give us some comments and some questions for the panel as well. So Gina, again.
Really to add on and say that neutrals have a lot of flexibility in structuring outcomes that can be resilient and sustainable. And just some examples of what I mean by that. If you look at the case that we've currently got in Indonesia, the team that's mediating that dispute is actually made up of independent third-party neutrals appointed by the CAO and representatives of the provincial government. And it's a really complicated structure to manage, and a complicated structure to safeguard against the complexities around giving advice and remaining neutral. But it works in the context of looking at sustainable outcomes because of the complexity of the issues that have come to us. In Cameroon, we're working with a tripartite structure that was actually set up when the bank invested. The bank, having pulled out of the investment, has left the parties with not much capacity to run the engine room of the structure. And so rather than replacing that, we're trying to work with that existing structure to channel some of the issues through, so that when we leave, that structure is still in place. And we're doing the same in Mexico. And I think what that is about being able to identify existing mechanisms that you can work with rather than trying to replace or replicate wherever possible. And just one quick thing around the sustainability of outcomes. Youth has been mentioned. What troubles me enormously in the cases that we work with is the lack of representation from women at the table. And I think we need to look at gender mainstreaming in all of the processes we do. If you look at UN Resolution 1325, which prescribes female gender neutrality and gender equity and representation and peace building and peacekeeping initiatives, it's because sustainable outcomes can only be achieved if 50% of the population or the community is actually represented at the table. And that's hugely challenging. I mean, we've got situations where if you say to a community in Northwest Africa, we're only going to mediate if you've got women representation as part of your team, well, they'll say, well, that's just culturally not what we're comfortable with. We have to find ways of getting women's voices through to the table. How do we do that? We can do that outside of the process. We can do that by team building, and those messages get fed through the formal channels of representation, but I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that.
I don't know the extent to which you found this panel interesting. All I can suggest is that I found it extremely interesting and really appreciate the experience that all of our panelists have shared and brought, the perspectives they've shared. I hope you'll join me in thanking them.